Further, an exposition of this kind constitutes the first part of science, because the existence of spirit, qua primary, is nothing but the immediate or the beginning, but not yet its return into itself. The element of immediate existence is therefore what distinguishes this part of science from the others. The statement of this distinction leads us into a discussion of some fixed ideas which usually crop up in this connection. Section 35 is another very short paragraph, and we might be tempted to pass over it. But Hegel's making, as always, important points during it, and I've got them sort of sketched out here on our chalkboard. I do want to sort of pick up actually where it ends. He says that the statement of this distinction leads us into a discussion of some fixed ideas which usually crop up in this connection. What does he mean there? Remember, he's just talked about the problem that in modernity we tend to work with these fixed ideas that we take for granted of, pick whatever. Could be theological ideas like God, could be notions of what science actually is. If in fact you're always, when we talk about science in terms of Hegel, you're always thinking in terms of science as conceived of by the popularizers of science and the scientific method as taught in your high school biology class or something like that. That would be an example of something that Hegel would call a fixed idea. Something that is unquestioned. That one says, I know this at least, and now I can build out from this. With dialectical philosophy, everything gets called into question, everything gets put under the microscope and scrutinized, everything gets brought in for analysis. And some of the fixed ideas turn out to be inadequate precisely because they're fixed. So he's in the next sections, he's going to be carrying out, some diagnosis and discussion of those. So let's see what's actually going on in this section. He says that spirit, what we're looking at right now, this developmental process, the exposition of this kind constitutes the first part of what? Of science. Why? Well, because we have to begin with something. And rather than just beginning by opening up a textbook and saying, aha, there's science, instead what we have to do is pay attention to things. We have to actually see what's there. We have to observe. We have to follow things out. We have to resist the temptation to say, aha, now I know it all, and actually keep paying attention. That's why it's called a phenomenology. We're paying attention to what it is that presents itself to us as we're carrying out this intellectual inquiry, which is tracing back to the very beginnings of consciousness, the very grounds of consciousness, and then seeing where it has gone, not just in the abstract, but through human history, through this vast process of stops and starts and half, successes, and 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, another 3 steps forward, and sometimes going off to the side as well. So he says that the existence of spirit as primary is nothing but the immediate or the beginning or immediate existence. And when we see this term immediate, we want to keep in mind that what's going on there is 2 things. Hegel is pointing out, every time he uses that word immediate, it's really a trick word, because nothing is immediate. Things only present themselves as being immediate, as being what's there and can be just assured, and we don't have to think about it anymore. We can now move on to cooler stuff. Within this word is a sort of you might say contradiction or privation or a crossing or taking away of mediacy, that is, of mediation. And the immediate presents itself as immediate precisely because we take it as such and don't look at how it's connected to other things and how it has what it is and what it will become and what it can do through those other things. That's to notice mediation or mediacy. That's to get away from the immediate. So he says that what's going on is at the beginning, when we're doing phenomenology, we have to begin with the immediate. We have to begin at, the elements, the beginning places. And we're not going to stay there, though, because what makes this spirit or mind or Geist in German is that it involves a process of return to itself. And probably I shouldn't just have put, one thing here, because after it manages to return to itself, now it's going to incorporate this again and spiral around and return to itself another time. And, I won't burden the chalkboard with all sorts of scribbles and spirals and circles, but you get the idea. There's going to be this ongoing process, and that's what he's describing in the next several paragraphs in a little bit more detail, but talking about the formal structure of them. The immediate existence of spirit, consciousness, contains the two moments of knowing and the objectivity negative to knowing. Since it is in this element of consciousness that spirit develops itself and explicates its moments, these moments contain that antithesis, and they all appear as shapes of consciousness. The science of this pathway is the science of the experience which consciousness goes through. The substance and its movement are viewed as the object of consciousness. Consciousness knows and comprehends only what falls within its experience. For what is contained in this is nothing but spiritual substance, and this too as object of the self. But spirit becomes object because it is just this movement of becoming an other to itself, that is, becoming an object to itself, and of suspending this otherness. And experience is the name we give just to this movement in which the immediate, the unexperienced, the abstract, whether it be of sensuous but still unsensed being, or only thought of as simple, becomes alienated from itself and then returns to itself from this alienation, and is only then revealed for the first time in its actuality and truth, just as it then has become a property of consciousness also. We need to begin with the immediate existence of spirit, the immediate existence of mind, the immediate existence of a distinctively human way of relating ourselves to things out there and ourselves and other people and the objects and ideas that we use to make sense out of things. And Hegel says that consciousness contains two moments that are going to be placed into antithesis with each other. And this is going to happen in terms of other similar moments as well, like, for example, truth and certainty. They're going to split apart. And this is integral to the dialectical process as Hegel understands it. There's always this Spaltung, this splitting, this doubling that takes place. But then there's an antithesis. The things stand against each other, and they look like they're just complete contradictions to each other. Notice that what we don't have here is thesis, antithesis, synthesis, right? Instead, we have two things as both being what consciousness is and an antithesis arising between them, which then has to be overcome. But it's going to be overcome over and over and over again in different ways. So we have knowing, knowledge, and in knowing, the subject is related to something else which it knows. It takes it in. It makes it its own. For me to know what Hegel is talking about is for me to make that my own, to bring it within the sphere of my own consciousness, and to be in a certain way assured of it. And that's when we start sliding over into objectivity. The objectivity negative to knowing. When we think that we know something, can we actually be sure that we know it? Do we have knowledge of our knowledge? Do we have knowledge squared? And what is it that we know? There is the act of knowing, and then there is the object of knowing. So we have all of these antitheses going on. Now, if we wanted to just sort of, separate everything out, then we would stop there. And that's where, we would end. But that's not what happened throughout human history, the history of thought, the history of consciousness. Instead, Hegel says, each time that we have something like this, these moments are incorporated. Spirit develops itself, explicates these moments, figures out for itself at that time, what is knowing for me now? What does it mean to know? What is objectivity, or what is the mode of the things that I'm actually trying to get out there and get to know, or get inside myself and get to know? It's going to come up with different answers at different points, and it's going to bring these two that seem to be totally irreconcilable back together into some sort of, not necessarily harmony, but some sort of synthesis. And he says they all appear as shapes of consciousness. And there's more than one shape of consciousness, more than one gestalt, more than one form. And so we can trace out a pathway, which is the dialectical process of development that he's been talking about in the earlier paragraphs. And we can arrange them into a kind of order, not just a sequential order, but an order which you could think of it as an order that's getting bigger and bigger and wider and more complex as time goes on. Because some of these early shapes may show up as having been assimilated and reoccurring down here in a different form. In any case, there's more than three, of course, but I'm just using a chalkboard. This is what Hegel calls the pathway. And that's what the phenomenology of spirit, as opposed to just say the phenomenology of paying attention to my own experience right here, right now. The phenomenology of spirit, trying to figure out what is it to be a human being by looking at the history of development and of thought, is charting out these shapes of consciousness, many of which we're long past, but in order to fully understand how we got to where we are, we need to sort of go back through them so we can fully grasp that. We need to sort of relive that. And this brings us to over here. What is this? This is what science is for Hegel. Science, again, is Wissenschaft, is this unifying, synthesizing, integrating, ever-expanding human knowledge, which is also reflective and able to take stock of itself. And it's going to be a science of the experience of consciousness, of spirit, of human beings who have made contributions that advanced the dialectic over the course of time. Some of them are going to be very generic. Hegel's not going to name a lot of names in the phenomenology. He's not going to say, and I have in mind here Voltaire, We have to sort of read between the lines with many of these. But if you know enough about those thinkers, you'll be able to recognize, as we go through these shapes, what's actually happening with them. So that's the first part of this paragraph. Now we actually need to do a little bit of erasure, just so we can clear the board, because he's going to say a few other things that are particularly important. He says that consciousness knows and comprehends only what falls within its experience, for what is contained in this is nothing but spiritual substance. This too is an object of the self. But spirit becomes object because spirit is this movement of objectifying itself, of becoming other to itself. Maybe I should put the other over here, actually. Because as it manages to make itself into an object, it becomes other to itself. Is this something that we have experience with? Sure. I mean, when you look in the mirror and you have the uncanny thing that, you're looking at yourself and you're like, do I really look like that? Is that really how I appear? Even better, film yourself. See how you actually come across, or record yourself. You become an object to yourself, and thereby also become an other to yourself. I have this experience sometimes when I read through my old writings from years ago, which are, many of them are quite good, some of them are actually quite bad, but I'll read them and I'll say, man, I guess I must have written this. I'm really kind of surprised that I did. That's a grasp of yourself as somebody other. It doesn't necessarily have to be in terms of scholarship, too. When you rise to an occasion, when you turn out to be more of a jerk or a bastard than you originally thought that you were, you surprise yourself, you are becoming an object, you are becoming an other to yourself. Other people can turn you into an object as well. It's possible for you to objectify yourself. So spirit becomes an object to itself, and it also has to suspend this otherness and bring it back to itself. That's what the process of spirit as active really is. Suspending this otherness, he says. Experience is the name we give to just this movement, in which the immediate, the unexperienced, we start out with that, and it becomes alienated from itself. That is, it becomes other. Alien means other, from itself, and then it's reincorporated back into this. So this is happening subjectively on the part of consciousness. The conscious being becomes other to itself and reincorporates it. It's also happening with what it is that the conscious being knows or experiences. The immediate, once it becomes reflected on, shows itself not to be immediate. For example, we could think about colors and light. We take colors as being just what they are. We don't realize that they're actually a product of light until we, start monkeying around with the settings. And suddenly we realize that the settings of the light make a big difference. They mediate the color and how it appears to us. We could go through a lot of examples of that. Think of food, for example. Cooking is a form of mediation. Hegel doesn't talk much about cooking. I don't get the idea he ever did much of it, but you could think about it that way. The process of changing things by applying heat to bring out the flavors that are in them. Somebody puts a plate of food in front of you already cooked. You take that as being something immediate. It just is what it is. Now you bite into it. Oh, that's so wonderful. There was an entire process and an entire historical process that culminated in that. And the reality of that is in part the other reality that you haven't uncovered yet and reincorporated into it. And when you do reincorporate that act of, as he calls it, overcoming the otherness, experience means so much more when we integrate it with thought, with reflection. That's what spirit has been doing throughout time, and that's what Hegel's trying to chart out. The disparity which exists in consciousness between the I and the substance which is its object is the distinction between them, the negative and general. This can be regarded as the defect of both, though it is their soul, or that which moves them. That is why some of the ancients conceived of the void as the principle of motion, for they rightly saw the moving principle as the negative, though they did not as yet grasp that the negative is the self. Now, although this negative appears at first as a disparity between the I and its object, it is just as much the disparity of the substance with itself. Thus, what seems to happen outside of it, to be an activity directed against it, is really its own doing, and substance shows itself to be essentially subject. When it has shown this completely, spirit has made its existence identical with its essence. It has itself for its object just as it is in the abstract element of immediacy. and of the separation of knowing and truth is overcome. Being is then absolutely mediated. It is a substantial content which is just as immediately the property of the I. It is self-like, or the notion. With this, the Phenomenology of Spirit is concluded. What spirit prepares for itself in it is the element of true knowing. In this element, the moments of spirit now spread themselves out in that form of simplicity which knows its object as its own self. They no longer fall apart into the antithesis of being and knowing, but remain in the simple oneness of knowing. They are the true in the form of the true, and their difference is only the difference of content. Their movement, which organizes itself in this element into a whole, is logic or speculative philosophy. There are two main movements going on within section 37. The first one I've more or less charted out here, and we'll go through it in just a moment. And the second one is actually going to lead us to another work, to the configuration of things that Hegel calls logic. And later on, Hegel, not much later on, Hegel will write a book called The Science of Logic. And as a matter of fact, there's a little bit of historical background. The Science of Logic and the later Encyclopedia Logic that he wrote for a long time overshadowed the Phenomenology of Spirit, because the logic presents the system as completed, whereas the Phenomenology of Spirit is us walking through all of the stages and scrutinizing them and seeing how things got to the complex articulated whole that they are. So we want to keep that in mind as we're plowing through this passage, and we'll get to that section, that discussion of logic in just a moment. So he says the disparity. Why is he talking about the disparity? Well, we're going to see the importance of the negative again. What is a disparity? It's when things are not pares, when they're not equal. They may not even be comparable at first. When we say apples and oranges, you're trying to compare apples and oranges. Well, you can actually compare apples and oranges because they are both round fruit, right? So they do have a lot in common. But, one is an apple-like fruit, that includes pears and quinces and stuff like that. The other one is a citrus fruit. Oranges are much more round than apples, Apples tend to be in a whole variety of colors. Oranges, more or less orange, But what we're talking about here is not two things of the same type, at least not at the start. Turns out that they are going to be much more similar, much more closely related. So Hegel's saying, look, in consciousness there is a disparity. There is a splitting again. There is a disjunction. There is a distinction that we can make between the I, the perceiver, the actor, the one who is conscious, and the object of consciousness, what it is that I am thinking of, what it is that I am aware of, what it is that I am experiencing. And it could be as close, it doesn't have to be something way over there, it could be as close as the feeling of the jacket on my shoulders. I am experiencing that, the not so tightness, but bindingness of the tie, the hardness of the collar. Those are all things that are to a certain extent outside of me but impinging upon me, and I am the one who's aware of them, right? I am the subject. This is often how we divide up our experience, because our experience is of things, of substances, things that exist, things that remain over time. We may not actually be able to get to the basis of substance a lot of the time. Locke could actually be quite correct about that. But we do think that there's something there that we are experiencing. And we don't think that that is us. We think it's something different, something other, something distinct. something not equal to us. And yet, it is for us, because we are the ones who are cognizing it. If we're acting upon it, we are the ones who are not only acting upon it, but intending into it, giving it meaning. So, what's really going on there? He says this disparity, this distinction between them, is the negative in general. Remember, we've seen the negative come up before. We're supposed to have patience and labor with the negative. The negative is this thing that allows us the freedom to develop. The power of the understanding is connected with the negative. And here's where he says, the negative is intrinsically connected with movement. Not movement in the sense of physical movement. He actually says the ancients were sort of onto this. That's why they conceived of the void as the principle of motion. So they saw the moving principle as the negative. They didn't quite grasp the negative as the self, as what it is that we are. We are a bunch of things. Like I can say I'm Gregory Sadler, 43 years old, born in Wisconsin, speaking English, thinking in English occasionally, dreaming in other languages or speaking other languages, but most of the time English. This tall, still have 10 fingers, 10 toes, one nose, likes to eat this, doesn't like to eat that. We have all these sorts of things that we can say about ourselves. I have a number of memories, and probably more than I could ever count up. I'm not going to do a Proustian task here. But we're also something different from that. We're also the thing that can say I. And insofar as I can say I distance myself from any one of those things. I am not just my memories. I am not just my perceptions. I am not just my relations to other things. I am a free being. I am able to act, to intend, to choose, to move, as Hegel is talking about it. So he says, although the negative appears at first as the disparity between the I and its object, it's just as much the disparity within the substance or the object with itself. Where is that going to get revealed? Later on, we're going to see that get revealed in the process of charting out what consciousness reveals to us. These things that we take to be immediate don't turn out to be immediate. They turn out to have these bifurcations and splittings within themselves when we look at them. Also, within the subject, there's going to be a splitting taking place within there. Here's where the secret comes in. This over here we take as being something independent of us, something standing against us that impinges upon us. That's why we perceive it. That's why we suffer it in some cases. But Hegel says, if we look at it in the right perspective, we realize that in a certain way it's actually us. This is what we call idealism. Reality is fundamentally not things that are totally independent of mind, consciousness, what it is that we are, but actually extensions or projections of it that take on a certain sort of independence, a certain sort of agency, just as we are not exactly what we are. There's the objects within ourselves as well, and we're all within, for Hegel, spirit. So he says, what seems to happen outside of it, to be an activity directed against it, is really its own doing. Substance shows itself to be, in its truth, subject. Where do we have subject? Over here. So these are actually both subject. What that means is that not only am I sort of tied up with all the things that I'm perceiving, knowing, acting upon, wishing for, intending, desiring, those things are also rooted in me. at the same time. There's a back and forth here. Neither one of them is independent of the other. So he says, when it is shown this completely, spirit has made its essence identical with existence. Now that's a very important phrase. Because what being has its essence identical with its existence in traditional philosophy and traditional theology? God. Now does that mean that I'm God? Because I'm the subject, I'm the phenomenologist charting out all this stuff? No, that doesn't mean that I'm God or Hegel is God, but it means that for Hegel, what's going on with this march of spirit through time, getting to know itself better and better, is God developing God's self through human agency, through human beings, through human consciousness in time. That's going to make him pretty heterodox to most Christian thinkers. It's interesting just to see how many gyrations a lot of Orthodox Christian thinkers had to go through to embrace Hegel in the 19th century. But there was also a strong reaction against him for that same reason. So he says, when it's shown this completely, spirit has made its existence identical with its essence. That's a big achievement. It has itself for its object just as it is. The abstract element of immediacy, the separation of knowing, which is something on the part of the subject, and truth on the part of the object, the separation between them, just as much as the separation between subject and object, has been overcome. How has it been overcome? By just fusing them together? No, by showing the interconnections between all of these things, by plotting it out, by laying it into this vast conceptual map that you can kind of picture in your head, but it takes a lot of work to do. The more that you work on it, the better you get at it. So he says, being is then absolutely mediated. Being is mediated, which means that it was always mediated from the beginning. We just were mixed up about it, and now we come to really understand the way things are. I come to understand that I am not what I assumed that I was, a totally independent being that just perceives things that don't impinge upon me, aren't part of my consciousness, and that those things aren't what they appeared to be at first either. So he says, with this, the Phenomenology of Spirit is concluded. Kind of a weird thing to say in the preface, isn't it? Especially when he's at the halfway point of the preface. He's not even done with the preface. But the Phenomenology of Spirit is concluded. What spirit prepares for itself in it is the element of true knowing. It brings together truth and knowledge. And it makes knowledge, not just knowledge of truth, but knowledge that is itself truth. So he says, in this element, the moments of spirit now spread themselves out in the form of simplicity, which knows its object as its own self. They no longer fall apart into the antithesis of being and knowing, but remain in the simple oneness of knowing. They're the true in the form of the true. And their difference is only, there's still difference there, difference of content. Everything has been thought out, everything has been made sense of, everything has been understood, and now it's just a matter of sort of like laying the whole thing out. This is, he says, their movement which organizes itself into a whole is logic or speculative philosophy. So the phenomenology will eventually lead us to a culmination point of logic, where now we actually understand the totality. And we don't understand it by effacing everything or fusing everything into one single primal experience the way some mystics want to do. Rather, it's by grasping the totality in all of its articulateness, all of its connections, all of its mediations, and seeing how they actually connect up with each other. Kind of tough to do. That means that if we want to have this viewpoint of the whole, we ourselves have to develop on the way to become adequate to what it is that Hegel is able to show us. Like most important books, and this is probably a great way to close this particular discussion, like most great books, we don't just read the book reads us. The book should change us. The book should be an obstacle course that requires us to get stronger, smarter, tougher, more resourceful to make sense out of what is in the book. And this is going to be a back and forth kind of process. So, what that really means is if you're struggling with Hegel, first off, you're not alone. I still struggle with Hegel, and I've been reading the guy now for close to 20 years. But if you're struggling with Hegel, that could be in part because of the difficulty of what it is that he's trying to set out for you, and you're going through the birth pangs, the growing pains that are required in order for you to develop what it is that you need in order to be able to grasp more and more fully what he's talking about.